Chapter 39, The Stalemated 70s, 1968 to 1980. Let's get started. Hey, how about a few key points? First of all, there are major shifts that are occurring in America. There's this stagflation, this end to the continued growth that the United States economy was experiencing after World War II. Also, support for the Vietnam War is going to significantly and abruptly change. People begin to question the status quo. Youthful protests are everywhere, much of which is related to the Vietnam War. There's also a strong resurgence in feminism. And finally, there are some significant efforts made to cool down the Cold War. So when we say stagflation, we mean stagnant demand with high inflation and high unemployment all at the same time. And this is going to occur throughout the 1970s as economic growth slowed. At the same time, more women and teens were entering the workforce. And deteriorating machinery and new regulations also hindered growth. Again, regulations, whether they're environmental or for safety, whatever they may be, they do cut into profits. And so, of course, that's going to be a problem for the economy. Also, the war itself and the Great Society programs are going to contribute to inflation. Take a look at this graph. You can see that inflation actually peaks in 75 and again in the middle of 1980. But unemployment also is sort of running alongside that and hitting high points, just about the same time. So there is a shift in industry. You see places like Japan and Germany come to dominate industries such as steel, automobiles, and consumer electronics. And certainly we think of quality craftsmanship coming from both of those countries. Just look at automobiles. Japanese vehicles are known for being reliable in addition to being fuel efficient and safe. And very affordable. German vehicles and just German products in general known for their quality and engineering, but in the world of automobiles, they tend to be the more luxurious, the more performance sort of side of the spectrum. I know that you see China and India on this graph here, but you can see that, again, countries outside the United States are experiencing economic growth at a time where we're talking about decline or stagflation in the American economy. So this phrase, Vietnamization, it basically just means pulling out American troops and resources and gradually shifting that burden over to the Vietnamese people. And this is something that Nixon's going to be advocating. He's going to withdraw 540,000 troops, as you can see, and the South Vietnamese army are going to take over with American weapons, money, training, and advice. And he adds to this Nixon doctrine, where it says the United States would honor its existing defense commitments, but other countries would not receive large numbers of American troops, I suppose, to try to prevent another Vietnam from happening. November 3rd, 1969, Nixon's speech to the silent majority was hopefully to drum up support. This was a group that supposedly still supported the war. Yeah, I'm talking to you over there. So while talking about Vietnamization, Nixon's also going to be attacking the enemy in Cambodia. Cambodia bordered South Vietnam, and it was officially neutral, but the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong have been using a trail system that runs through Cambodia to move men, material, and supplies to the south. So on April 29, 1970, Nixon ordered American forces to attack the enemy in Cambodia, and protests erupted in the United States. The most well-known is at Kent State University, during which the National Guard shot 4 students. And obviously this is going to cause a lot of concern in the country. Now we have college students who are protesting and being fired upon and killed. And so it adds to that anti-war sentiment that is running kind of wild here. Troops will be withdrawn from Cambodia on June 29, 1970, but as you can see here, it only intensifies the conflict between the Hawks and the Doves. Again, the Hawks are the pro-war supporters, and the Doves would be the anti-war folks in the country. Here's an iconic photo from that day at Kent State. Also in 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed, which lowered the voting age to 18. And the Pentagon Papers were leaked. It was a top-secret Pentagon study that had documented the deceptions of the previous presidential administrations in regards to the Vietnam War. Sort of like the idea of a prolonged escalation. Alright, so while the Soviet Union and China were both communists, they sort of disagreed over what Marxism actually was, and Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, they had hoped to use this tension between the Soviets and the Chinese to play one country off the other. Nixon and Kissinger had hoped to get the Soviet Union and China to actually pressure North Vietnam into peace. So in 1972, Nixon visited China, and he paved the way for improved relations between the U.S. and Beijing. In May of 72, Nixon traveled to Moscow and he negotiated détente, or he relaxed the tension between the Soviet Union and China. And the U.S. agreed to sell the Soviets at least $750 million worth of wheat, corn, and other cereals. And in addition to that, two agreements also slowed the arms race between America and the Soviets, the first of which is an anti-ballistic missile treaty, which limited the U.S. and the Soviet Union to two clusters of defensive missiles. And the second was the SALT agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which froze the numbers of long-range nuclear missiles for 5 years. Here's Nixon negotiating, looking very stern. And here's some of the ballistic missiles that we're talking about that could deliver warheads. Let's talk about the Supreme Court. Earl Warren was appointed as Justice of the Supreme Court in 1953, and he made many controversial rulings. You can see some of them here. Griswold versus Connecticut, shout out to Connecticut. 1965 struck down a state law that banned the use of contraceptives, even by married couples, creating a right to privacy. Gideon v. Wainwright ruled that all criminals were entitled to legal counsel, even if they were unable to afford it. In 1964, we have Escobedo and Miranda in 1966, which ruled that those who were arrested had the right to remain silent. And this, of course, leads to the Miranda warning. And here's Earl Warren. In Engel v. Vitale, 1962, and School District of Abington Township versus Shemp, 1963, it was ruled that public schools could not require prayers or Bible readings. Reynolds v. Sims, 1964, ruled that the state legislatures would be required to be reapportioned according to population. Now, in an attempt to end some of these liberal rulings, Nixon set Warren E. Burger to replace the retiring Earl Warren in 1969, and by the end of 1971, the Supreme Court had 4 new Nixon-appointed members on the bench. Nixon built on the Great Society programs by increasing funding for Medicare, Medicaid, and aid to families with dependent children. He also created the Supplementary Security Income, giving benefits to the poor, aged, blind, and disabled. His Philadelphia Plan in 1969 required construction trade unions to establish quotas for hiring black employees, and it changed definition of affirmative action to include preferable treatment on groups as opposed to individuals. The Supreme Court ruling in Griggs v. Duke Power Company in 1971 upheld this. Many whites protested this decision and actually called it reverse discrimination. You can see the spending that goes into Medicare and Medicaid in terms of its percentage of the federal budget. Nixon also created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, OSHA. If you work in a restaurant, you might know what OSHA is and what they do. They come in to inspect conditions, for example, to make sure that things are sanitary that are being prepared for customers. Also, the Consumer Product Safety Commission was created as well. And again, all these agencies give the federal government more control over businesses. In 1962, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring exposed the harmful effects of pesticides. She's sort of a 1960s muckraker, if you want to think of it that way. We also have the Clean Air Act, 1970, and the Endangered Species Act, 1973, both aimed at protecting and preserving the environment. Now, Nixon imposed a 90-day wage freeze and then took the nation off the gold standard. He was worried about inflation. This ended the Bretton Woods system of international currency stabilization, which was the agreement that each country would tie its monetary exchange rate to gold. Nixon also had a Southern strategy, which helped him to win the Southern vote. This strategy really opposed civil rights for African Americans. So 1972 is an election year. In the spring, the North Vietnamese burst through the DMZ, and in response to that, Nixon ordered massive bombing campaigns on strategic centers, which did stop the North Vietnamese offensive. The Democrats will run a man named George McGovern in 72, and he's going to campaign on this platform that includes a 90-day pullout of Vietnam. But Nixon will win the re-election in 1972 in a landslide. Take a look at the map here. You can see. So despite what we were talking about with Ted before in the previous chapter and the change in terms of how people viewed the war, it seems as though Nixon still and the idea of continued presence in Vietnam, at least in 72, was in fact the norm. So after winning re-election, Nixon's going to order a 2-week bombing campaign of North Vietnam, and his goal was to force the North Vietnamese to the peace table. And on January 23, 1973, the North Vietnamese negotiators did agree to a ceasefire agreement, but the text suggests this was actually just a disguised American retreat. So despite assurances to the American public that Cambodia's neutrality was being respected, it was discovered that secret bombing raids on North Vietnamese forces in Cambodia had been taking place since March of '69, and this caused a lot of people to question their trust of the government. The bombing campaign will end in June 1973. Here's a map where you can see, by the way, the location of Cambodia next to South Vietnam, and of course Laos above that. And again, this Ho Chi Minh Trail dipped into both of those two countries, neutral countries, and allowed North Vietnamese to move men and material south. Now, about the same time, Cambodia is going to be taken over by a dictator named Pol Pot. He's going to commit genocide of his own people, 2 million people, over a few years. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, and it required the president to tell Congress within 48 hours of commitments of U.S. troops to foreign conflicts. Remember that Gulf of Tonkin incident that allowed Johnson to sort of escalate the war without congressional approval, and now there's some checks on that. There's a feeling of this new nationalism that discouraged U.S. troops from being used in other countries' wars that's beginning to take hold. And of course, this is probably a product of the massive nationwide youthful protests of the war in general. All right, so in 1973, we have the Yom Kippur War. Syria and Egypt were trying to regain territory they lost to Israel during the Six-Day War, and American support helped Israel win, but it caused the Arab nations of OPEC to impose an oil embargo on the U.S. Some things were done to try to conserve oil, including a speed limit of 55 miles per hour created. Also, an oil pipeline in Alaska was approved in 1974, and other forms of energy were supposed to be researched. But the embargo caused an economic recession in America and several other countries, and OPEC did lift this embargo in 1974, but it quadrupled the price of oil. And so you're going to see gas lines during the shortage and oil crisis like this. You're going to see signs letting you know whether or not you can even buy gas on that day. You can see some of these major events, including the embargo being lifted over here, 1974, and you can see the spike in oil prices, and obviously some other events we haven't quite covered yet, including the Iran-Iraq war, and so forth. But again, you can see how the price of oil is going to be tied to these major events in the Middle East. And here's a map showing you OPEC. You can see those that are starred are the founding members. June 17, 1972, 5 men working for the Republican Committee for the Re-election of the President were caught breaking into the Watergate Hotel and bugging the Democrats' rooms. And after the Watergate scandal, it was discovered that the Nixon administration were actually involved in other cases of corruption and dirty tricks as well, maybe where the nickname Tricky Dicky came from. Many prominent members of the president's administration resigned. Vice President Spiro Agnew was forced to resign for taking bribes, and Congress would replace him with Jerry Ford, who will later become president. Now, Nixon claimed he had no knowledge of these illegal activities, but a man named John Dean III, who was a former White House lawyer, testified about how Nixon tried to cover up the Watergate scandal. October 20th, 1973, we have the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon fired Archibald Cox, the prosecutor of the Watergate scandal. He actually issued the subpoena for the tapes, audio tapes that is. The Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General resigned because they did not want to fire Cox. And when conversations involving the Watergate scandal were discovered on tapes, Nixon refused to hand them over to Congress, despite denying any participation in the scandal. On July 24th, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to submit all tapes to Congress. And on August 5th, 1974, Nixon released the 3 tapes that held the most damaging information. One of these, known as the Smoke and Gun tape, proved that Nixon had played an active part in the attempted cover-up of the Watergate scandal. August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned due to pressures from his own party. Not really sure what to say about this one here. And that brings Jerry Ford to the office of president, and his popularity and respect will actually sink pretty quickly as he issues a full pardon of Nixon. and that sets off some accusations of this being a buddy deal. July 1975, Ford signed the Helsinki Accords, which recognized Soviet boundaries and helped to ease tensions between the two nations. Early in 1975, the North Vietnamese invaded South Vietnam, and Ford actually requested aid for South Vietnam, but this was rejected by Congress. South Vietnam quickly fell, and the last Americans were evacuated on April 29, 1975. The estimated cost of the war was 56,000 dead, $188 billion, and another 300,000 Americans wounded. But more than that, America had lost face in the eyes of foreigners. It certainly had a hit to its own self esteem. It lost some confidence in its military power. Again, Vietnam was a non conventional war in terms of the types of strategies that could be used because of the geography of that country. But still, the U.S. did not have the success that it had during World War II. It was impacted economically, and it certainly I suppose, in terms of its global leadership, is going to take a hit in that regard as well. 1972, Congress passed Title IX of the Education Amendments, prohibiting sex discrimination in any federally assisted educational program. Congress approved the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, but it would not be ratified by enough states, and that amendment would have prohibited laws that discriminated based on sex. 1973, Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court invalidated laws that were banning abortion. And we're going to see, obviously, an increase in abortion at that point. But since then, you can see in 2014, abortion had hit a historic low. 1974, the Supreme Court ruled in Milliken v. Bradley that desegregation plans could not require students to move across school district lines, and this reinforced the white flight. 1978, the Supreme Court ruled in the University of California versus Back that universities could not favor applicants based on the quality of race. The Supreme Court, the only black justice in the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall, warned that the denial of racial preferences might erase the progress gained by the civil rights movement. In U.S. v. Wheeler in 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that Native American tribes had limited sovereignty. All right, 1976, Democrat Jimmy Carter, seen on the right there, will beat Republican Jerry Ford to win the presidency. Carter actually promised to never lie to the American public, and he was quite inexperienced in dealing with the politics of Washington. This is the bicentennial, the 200-year birthday of the USA in 1976, and there were tall ships in New York Harbor, for example, very patriotic gatherings. You can see the Twin Towers in the background. A little eerie to see that now, don't you think? But there were large parades and demonstrations. It was a surge in patriotism in general. President Carter mediated peace talks between Israel and Egypt on September 17th, which is Constitution Day, by the way, 1978. You got the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Egypt together at Camp David, and they signed peace accords. They agreed to, Israel agreed to withdraw from a territory it had gained in the 1967 war as long as Egypt respected Israel's territories. Carter also pledged to return the Panama Canal to Panama by the year 2000 and resume full diplomatic relations with China in 1979. Now, the inflation rate was steadily climbing, and by 1979 it was at 13%. So you can see we're no longer economically isolated from the world, if there's any doubt about that. And to try to reduce America's cost of dependence on foreign oil, Carter called for legislation to improve energy conservation. There was not much support for that. In 1979, Iran's Shah Mohammad Pahlavi, who had basically been installed by America in 1953 and ruled as a dictator, is going to be overthrown and succeeded by Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, Iranian fundamentalists were opposed to Western customs, and they stopped exporting oil. OPEC also raised oil prices and caused another oil crisis. In July of 79, Carter retreated to Camp David and met with hundreds of advisors to come up with a solution to America's problems. July 15th, he gave his Malaise speech, in which he chastised American people for their obsession with material goods, stunning the nation. A few days later, he fired 4 of his cabinet secretaries. Also in 79, Carter signed the SALT II agreements with the Soviet leader Brezhnev, but the U.S. Senate refused to ratify it. December 27, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which ended up turning into the Soviet Union's version of Vietnam. And because Afghanistan bordered Iran, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan posed a threat to American oil supplies. Carter placed an embargo on the Soviet Union and he boycotted the Olympic Games in Moscow. He also proposed a rapid deployment force that could quickly respond to a crisis anywhere in the world. You see sort of a map of the Soviet-controlled territory in Afghanistan, and of course you can see Iran on its northwest border. November 4th, 1979, a group of anti-American Muslim militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took hostages, and they demanded that the U.S. return the exiled Shah, who had arrived in the U.S. 2 weeks earlier for cancer treatments. And to resolve the Iranian hostage crisis, Carter first tried economic sanctions on Iran, which did not work. He also tried a commando rescue mission that had to be aborted, and that's going to be sort of a stain to his legacy. The crisis will not be solved until January 20th, 1981, when Ronald Reagan is inaugurated. As you can see from the headline here of the New York Times. Well, that's it for Chapter 39. Hard to believe we're talking about Ronald Reagan right now. Good news, we've started our review for the APUSH exam. We are back in Period 1 looking at things we looked at way back in September. Just 3 more chapters ago, folks. Keep working hard. We're almost there. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or let me know in class. Take care.